We are in the midst of that fun time of year in Missouri, right, where we can't predict the weather and what's going to come. It's at this time of year when I look at it and I go, well, what I'd really like to do is I'd like to go outside and I'd like to grill a hamburger in my flip-flops and shorts. Also knowing that it's probably going to be 20 degrees outside and blowing that snow, rain, sleet junk that we had yesterday, right? That wasn't enough to really cover the ground, but it was enough to make everything a slushy mess for a while. Jack loved it, but we had to keep him out of a few puddles that would have swallowed him up as he was bouncing around out there. But on the other side of that, what I would really also like to do is I want to make a big pot of stew. Put it on the oven, put everything in, let it simmer all afternoon so that that smell permeates the house, right? Knowing full well that I'm going to be sweating like crazy, but by golly, I am not going to turn the air conditioning on because it's only March. That is where we are. It is that time of year, and now I really just want some stew, right? If you're watching at home, let me put this up here real quick. Yes, one of the weirdest things I think I've ever done is I put the definition of stew up on the screen in the middle of worship. But it's the stewing, whatever it is, it's to cook or be cooked slowly in liquid in a closed dish or pan. I'm going to blame the youth for this because they're the ones that kind of helped me do this. Sorry, I'm going to throw you all under the bus. But we were meeting last week and we were talking, and I said, "Oh, well, folks, we're stewing in something." And said, "Well, what does stew mean?" And that's when I realized stewing is now an old person word. And I use it well, but we know what that means, right? We have thoughts, we have things we're dealing with that we're struggling with, whatever it is, and we're like cooking in our own thoughts for a while. We just kind of sit there. We don't ever really accomplish anything. We don't get through anything, but it just kind of sits in one place and does that thing where it cooks slowly, hopefully not in a liquid, but in a closed dish or pan for a really long time. And we were talking about that, and sometimes stewing can be good. We know this more and more as we kind of look at the world we're in today, that it is, and we are more connected to things, that often it is good to disconnect from the things that are around us if we're trying to understand something or we're trying to deal with it, and we just kind of disconnect from all the things. Even sometimes it means you go off to someplace separate so you can work through whatever it is that is going on. A good stew cooks for a long time, but it can help us to fix very real problems. And it can help produce great masterworks even. But stewing can be bad also. Most often it's bad when we don't know that that's what we're doing. You ever looked at someone and say, "Well, I'm just trying to fix something," and you look at them and you say, "No, you're stewing." And they're like, "No, I'm not." We're really good about ignoring that part of things. It's not easy to identify when we're doing that badly. The trick is to know which one are we doing at any given point in time. And that's hard for us to understand, to find that place and to know what it is. On the good side of things, we watch in the last part of the Gospels and into the book of Acts even, where the disciples do this well. They are stuck in Jerusalem after Easter, but before Pentecost gets here, and they can't leave. They're not happy about this. They're frightened by this, and they are stewing in Jerusalem. But by golly, when Pentecost gets here, they go out and they make disciples. They share the gospel to the ends of the earth after that. It's an amazing thing that happens, that even though they spend that time before they leave stewing, but when they go out and they do great things. On the more lighthearted side of things, James Cameron is well known for his stewing in the movies that he writes and he directs. He will sometimes take years, and he'll invent new technologies even, just to get all of the right details that he is looking for. And other folks would look at him and they'd say, "James, it's fine as it is. You don't need to do all of that. It's good enough." And he's like, "No. I'm going to spend this time just to make sure I get this 3 little second cut of video exactly right." I mean, it must pay off. He now has written and directed 3 of the top 4 highest grossing movies of all time. All of them over $2 billion for something like a total of 2.5 billion, that's billion with a B, dollars in gross from one guy who has written and directed those movies. And he's not even through the Avatar series yet. He could probably make the top 4 out of the top 5, or even all top 4 at some point if he's not careful. But there's a bad kind of stewing also. And this is the one that we're often more familiar with, but we struggle to identify. This is where this morning I'm going to give you plenty of fair warning. I want you to hold your toes, because my goal is, now that I've made you hungry talking about stew, I'm going to take that hunger away by stepping on your toes. So that's my goal, just fair warning me, that's where we're going to go with that. And if I miss a few of them, I'm sorry, I will try harder next time. So let's start by talking about the things we stew about that we don't often think that's what we're doing and that we're dealing with as a society. And so we're going to start big and we're going to rip that Band-Aid right off. More kids every year, more kids and teens, are killed by guns than by anything else. And if you watch the news at all, we seem to be far more concerned about drag queens than we are about that. Did I start off okay? I'm working on it. But let's not start there. Let's go to the other side of this. I was reading an article here a couple weeks ago about a report about some folks did that was found a very strong correlation with, and we're able to say that kids from liberal backgrounds have more problems with mental health, stress, and anxiety than kids from conservative backgrounds. They had a hard time figuring out what the connection is there, but they could identify a correlation. One of the possible theories is that it is possible that the constant exposure to trying to be as inoffensive as possible may be causing higher levels of stress and anxiety. Did I get some more toes? We got a few more, then I promise we'll come back to things. Another big topic in the news in the last little bit, and that is overturning Roe versus Wade won't stop abortions. And it won't solve a whole lot of other problems either. But on the other side of that, arguably, Roe versus Wade was a bad precedent to begin with, and even Ruth Bader Ginsburg said as much. And it was not hard to see the last few years that the just right case was waiting to overturn what was a very flimsy sort of precedent. Okay, we're going to keep going, just 2 more, I promise, and then I'm done. We are still suffering from the impacts of systemic racism in the United States and its continuing harm to its citizens and entire communities of people, and that has been going on for generations. If you are unsure of what that means, look to the most recent Justice Department report that came out about the Louisville, Kentucky Police Department. Yet, throwing money at the problem won't fix it, defunding the police won't stop it, and there's no single government policy that will make it go away. There are some that will help, but there's not a silver bullet in there. One more and I promise that I'm done. The United States does not operate as a true capitalistic society. Free markets aren't the solution to everything, tax cuts won't make everything work better, but also, free markets work. And they can be the right solution to a problem even when we don't want to hear that. And they aren't always the most efficient, but by golly, they're effective. And just printing more money and throwing it at a problem won't fix it either. Did I miss any toes? I can keep going. There's plenty of stuff out there that we could go on with. So the big question I had in doing all this today was, why bring this up today? Especially on a day when Richard's already laughing at this, because on a day when we're going to go down and have lunch afterwards for Pastor Appreciation Month. It seems like bad planning on my part that I'm going to intentionally step on toes like that. Partially I blame the youth because they started this. So it's just looking at me like, what? It's too early. But also I blame it on the lectionary because during the season of Lent, I like to use the lectionary because it helps me kind of pace things and build towards Easter. And our reading out of Exodus this morning really takes us there. But also, in the middle of this, there is an explanation. There is what we need to see, I think. And the first thing to say is that all of those things I just described are all examples of where we have been stewing as a society for years, decades, and generations. They're all things that we have tossed into a pot, we've mixed them up, we've turned up the heat, we put the lid on, and we have let them go and simmer for a very long time. Every once in a while, the lid comes off, some of the steam comes out, and rather than do something about it, sometimes we just put the lid back on. Sometimes we add more stuff to the pot. Sometimes we turn the heat up a little bit more underneath it. Sometimes we do all of it all together. We just throw it back in and we let it go again. We keep letting it stew. What happens if we never actually deal with any of this? We never actually take it out of the pot. At a certain point, and it becomes inedible, and yet we're going to put it back on the burner to cook some more, because that seems like a good idea. After a while, either we're going to ruin the pot, everything is going to bubble over, we're going to start a fire, because I've known some really bad cooks in my time, and they burn pasta. Like the boiling water part, they managed to burn it. We're going to create, have you ever let something cook too long and it gets that rancid smell that permeates the walls, and at a certain point you're like, there's no amount of kills that will take care of this, we're just going to sell the house? Like, that's the other option in there too. Asked me sometime about a store manager I had where I worked at an Office Max, and a burrito she left in the microwave for 20 minutes. Unfortunately for us, we live in a time when all of those things that we've left stewing, sometimes for decades or longer, are making their presence known. And we have a choice. We can either do something about them, or we can put the lid back on and we can kick that can down the road for our kids to deal with. But I think maybe now is a time when we should figure out, how do we help to begin to address this? To get to that point, though, let's go back to an old story. The Israelites are finding themselves at the beginning of a stew. They are at this place where they are, and it's one that actually, as far as the story goes in Exodus, it's coming on very quickly that they're getting to this, and so they're trying to figure this out. And remember what Exodus is doing. God is taking these people that have been enslaved for hundreds of years, and he is forming them into a new nation. One that had never existed before, because before they were enslaved in Egypt, they were just a very large nomadic family moving from place to place. They settled just there outside of Egypt, and then they were there for hundreds of years, and they become enslaved as a part of that, and then they come out of Egypt, and now they're this giant nation of people wandering around in the wilderness, and God is wanting to form them into a nation. And so they're finding themselves now out there, and they're trying to figure out how to make this work. They've come out of Egypt, they've crossed the Red Sea, they've settled in the wilderness, they're headed to Mount Sinai where God is going to give them the 10 Commandments, and God is literally feeding them with bread from heaven. Despite all the other things that are going on, that almost sounds like a vacation, doesn't it? I mean, you might call it glamping, but it's almost there. Some of you have ever eaten trail food, you know that bread from heaven sounds like a much better plan than that, right? Or if you've ever been in the military and eaten an MRE. They say meals ready to eat, but this is a sign they're headed to a good stew, though. They now have the space to breathe. They've unclenched all of their muscles that they've been holding in. They're beginning to let out all of the anxiety they have been holding on to ever since Moses showed up and started talking to Pharaoh, saying, demanding Pharaoh let them leave Egypt. And somewhere along the way, they've all realized that they're thirsty. And so what we really need is just a good drink of water. And Moses, you are the guy to do it. And Moses himself is kind of concerned with how he's going to make all of that happen. And so they're working themselves up into a first-rate tizzy, and to the point that Moses is afraid for his life. He goes to God and he says, God, what am I going to do? Some of these folks, they're going so far as they're wanting to kill me because I can't give them anything to drink. So step one in fixing someone who is stewing, especially to this degree, is to know that you aren't going to fix them by telling them to stop. I mean, that sounds obvious, doesn't it? Because when in the course of ever has telling someone to stop stewing ever caused someone to stop stewing, right? But that's, sometimes it's good to state the obvious. Keep in mind that they are working themselves up into this, and they haven't even gotten to the 10 Commandments yet, where they do the thing that will keep them wandering in the wilderness for 40 years. So this is before we get to all of that part. They haven't even gotten to the hardest part of their problems. But what God does Because he says, you're thirsty. Okay, here's some water. And then we get verse 7. And this is a really important verse in here. And this is Moses' response to all of this. And this is Moses talking here. He called the place Massah and Meribah because the Israelites argued with and tested the Lord, asking, is the Lord really with us or not? By naming a place. It's like making a note in your calendar. Anytime you see this in the Old Testament, this is something that is meant as a reminder. And you're going to see that all throughout the Old Testament because they weren't, we received the stories in written format, but there was no one writing down all of this at the time. So they named all these places and there was meaning behind all of them. These were all little reminders that they were writing on their calendars saying, hey, don't forget this. Don't forget this thing. It's a reminder of where they were. Because remember, God is going to be forming them, and so we're going to see a series of these reminders all over the place, helping them to know how they have changed, how they have been formed, how they've been different, and how they see things differently as they go. And we begin to see that in the very next verse. In verse 8 starts another little part of the story where the Israelites are going into battle against another group of people, and they win a great victory. Remember, these are folks that probably hadn't held a weapon too long before all of this, because they had been enslaved, and the Egyptians were worried about this large group of slaves revolting against them. And yet they win this great battle through God's support. Go back and read that story sometime. This is a great story. When we get in verse 15, we get the next reminder in there. Moses built an altar there and called it, "The Lord is my banner," saying to them, remember what God did here. For everything that you are going through, all the worries that you have, God is still here. If you're going to stew, fine, but don't let it turn into mush. So what does this have to do with anything that I talked about before? Those things that I talked about before are all things that we've been stewing on, and we're doing so badly right now. On guns, education, abortion, sexuality, mental health, racism, economics, and livelihood, and that list can go on. We've been stewing and stewing and stewing. And there's different groups of people out there. There's some that want us to go back to Egypt, that say it was better back in the day. Historians will tell us that things are never as good back in the day as we think they are now. And Moses had his own group. Remember, there are folks in this very story who said, if we just go back to Egypt, yeah, sure. Maybe we were enslaved, but at least we had food. We had water back there. There's another group of folks, Moses hasn't gotten to them yet, but they're coming up in the story that will say, they basically will say to Moses, Moses, thank you for your service. You got us this far, but you obviously can't get us any farther than this. We need a change in leadership, and we're going to go forward from here. And we're going to take this ball from here on out. The one thing that everyone agrees on is that they all will say, this is all about water. We're all just thirsty. If you know anything about large groups of people, you know that the very last thing that this is actually about is water. That's just the proverbial straw that broke the camel's back, because I'm full of cliches. What it's really about is that we're scared, we're afraid, we don't know what's coming next. Right now, but it's been building for a couple of generations, it feels like we're coming out of something big, and the future is really uncertain, and whichever we group that we are a part of, wants to be in control, because that's the thing we can hold on to. If we can be in control, then we're okay. That's hard. This week I was listening to a podcast on church leadership. Emily's rolling her eyes at me right now, because of course I was listening to a podcast. But on church leadership, because as a preacher, that's probably what you're supposed to do. And they were talking about Sabbath rest. Like, where could possibly be the problem in talking about Sabbath rest? I was listening to it, and this is normally a podcast that I learn a lot from, and it's on the balance of things, it's a more of a left-leaning podcast. Wait, that's your right. It's a left-leaning podcast. Let me get my stage directions correct up here. And they were talking about this, and before they got to the statement that really kind of got me, I was already kind of not happy with them. But they get to a statement, they make a statement, and I'm going to paraphrase it because I didn't write it down because I was driving at the time. But they said, everyone should take a Sabbath day, especially if you are a part of the church. You should let God take care of church for one day. Right? That's what was kind of my reaction. Like, wait a minute. So you can see where I got a little bit upset with that. But not to be outdone, from the more conservative side of things, you all remember the Super Bowl, right? I mean, it's where Chiefs fans up here, we remember the Super Bowl. There were a couple of commercials in there that I had a fairly low bar set for. They exceeded that bar nicely. They were very well done commercials, if you have seen them. And they were a part, there was a group that was putting them on as part of an ad campaign called He Gets Us. And they have as their goal this statement. And this is, I found this on their website, so it's quoting them. It's a sustained effort to create a new movement to increase the respect and relevance for Jesus in our culture and call up Christians to reflect him in their interactions with others. 95% of that statement I am okay with, and I agree with, and will try to live out as the best I can. But there's one part in there that gets me every time I see it. Jesus needs us to make him respectable. Yes, you did, bud. But that's the part that always gets me when I hear that. So Jesus needs us to make him respectable. I'm not sure that's how that actually works. Here's where we've been doing so badly. We keep thinking that we are the ones that have to take on the burden of solving all of the world's problems. And because we're taking on the burdens, then our solution obviously is the right solution because we're the one that's taking that on. And despite that, when we are shown that at best we are only partially right in that, we double down on being right because remember, we're trying to hold on to things because it's what we can hold on to in the moment. And we find ourselves trying to out-God God, and we're failing at it. If we want to stop failing, then we have to do a few things. The first is, again, this is like the obvious one, we have to stop trying to out-God God. The second is to know that we aren't always right about things. Even if we vehemently disagree with someone, sometimes they're right. In our house, this is the moment when I look over at Emily and say, I don't want to agree with the hecklers. But sometimes the hecklers are right. And hecklers, by the way, are anyone that disagrees with me, so that's a very broad term. The third is to stop stewing and trust in God. Already at the beginning of Israel's journey, God had been taking care of them, getting them out of Egypt, helping to prepare them for that, getting them to that place where they could go and they could be formed out in the wilderness. And even when they weren't trusting of God, God was still there. You know what? I'll help you with your water. I'm going to give you food to eat. And I'm going to lead you through the wilderness so that you can get there, despite everything else that they were doing. Sometimes we have to remember that we are not the solution to everything. And that's actually a good thing. Every time period, every generation has their problems, some worse than others. Where we go off the rails and our stew threatens to make the house smell bad is when we try to handle all of it on our own. We try to be the solution to every problem, even though we're competing against other folks who want to do the same thing. If we want to do better, then we can't be the chef. We can't be driving things. We have to follow, because we know that God has already got all of this in his hands. We can do that. Surprisingly enough, great things will come. Problems will get fixed. Solutions will be found. And things will get better. But we have to let God lead. God helps us to know that he gave us those reminders all through the Old Testament. Read through sometime and watch all the places that get named as the story goes on that are the reminders for us to let God be the one in charge. But then we get to the gospel story, and he sends Jesus to come into the world to help us see that even more clearly. To let him be the one that we follow that leads us. And that is a message we can take out to a world that needs it. Mostly we just need to share it amongst ourselves and get all of us together on that direction. And as we do that, the rest of the world will take notice, and we can change the world because we follow him. Let us go, let us follow him, and let us do that. Do all of this in his name. Amen.